Welcome everyone to this webinar today. Is the fourth of the webinar series that we run at the Reuters Institute. We hope that you had a great Easter holiday if you could. Well, we are really lucky today because we are going to have Rasmus Nielsen. He's our director. He's also the lead author of the new report that we published yesterday. It's a report on how people in 6 countries get news and rate news and information around the coronavirus. Before starting, a little bit of housekeeping, the rules of the webinar. After I make this brief introduction, Rasmus will show his presentation. We will mute every microphone and hide every camera. So please keep both that way so everyone can follow the speaker. You can send any questions at any time by dropping us a message through the chat function that you see just on your screen. And I will pass the questions to Rasmus, hopefully as many as I can. We will finish the seminar in an hour or so I think we have plenty of time for questions after the presentation. And without further ado, Rasmus, the virtual floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for finding the time to join. I've learned in recent weeks I'm supposed to say that I hope that you're all staying negative. I'm going to share my screen now to go through this new piece of research, which is a piece of work from the Misinformation Science and Media project that we at the Reuters Institute are running with the Oxford Internet Institute and with support from the Oxford Martin School here at the University of Oxford. And we've just published yesterday a new report where we use an online survey conducted from late March and into early April to look at how a representative sample of internet users in 6 different countries across the world access information and news around the coronavirus, and how they rate the trustworthiness and usefulness of different sources and platforms for information. In the survey, we also asked people a set of questions around their behavior, what they do in response to the crisis, and a set of questions around what they know about the disease, so that we can link their media habits with outcomes like how informed they are and what they are doing in response to this crisis. It's clear that this is a snapshot. This is a difficult situation. It's a situation that is developing over time. And we shouldn't necessarily assume that the things we found now are going to be stable throughout the length of the coronavirus crisis. But I think it gives a really useful insight into where we are now in terms of how people access news and information, how they think about it, and what that means for how much they know about the disease. This is a complicated piece of work that I was lucky to work with Richard Fletcher, Scott Brennan, Nick Newman, and Philip Howard from the Oxford Internet Institute on. And I don't want to try to cram everything into this session, though I'm happy to take questions on any part of this presentation, the report, or other issues that people feel that we may have research insights into from the Reuters Institute. But just really wanted today to take this opportunity to highlight sort of 3 key findings from my point of view from the report that we've just published. So the first, I think, is really this, which is that most people in our survey say that they rely on news organizations for news and information about coronavirus. Most respondents consider news organizations a relatively trustworthy source of information. And in most of the 6 countries, those who rely on news organizations also know more about the coronavirus. It's not just the people who are using news and are trusting news organizations, it's also that those who do it are more informed and more knowledgeable about the disease. The second key finding is that it's clear, of course, that people don't access information only via the news. They also do it via various kinds of platforms that are, of course, very different in their basic operations and their purpose and whatnot and their business models. But broadly speaking, if we look at search engines, social media, video sites, and messaging applications, there's 4 different kinds of digital platforms. These are very widely used as sources of news and information about the coronavirus. Interestingly, people use them very widely, but they don't trust them nearly as much as they trust news organizations in most cases and in most countries. And also, we find no consistent evidence that people who rely on platforms know more about the coronavirus than people who rely on other sources.
Rasmus, please, could you share your screen? because he's not sure at the moment.
Sorry, let's try again.
And also, if you can put your volume up a little bit, if possible.
I don't think there is more to do with the volume.
Okay, great.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes,
Yeah?
now it's, thanks.
Okay, I was just summarizing this, the second of the key findings, where, as I said, we find no evidence that people who rely on platforms know more about the disease than those who don't. But I think also potentially as important is that there is no evidence, consistent evidence across these countries, that people who rely on platforms know less about the disease either. So while it's very clear that there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of it flourishing also on digital platforms, we find no evidence that people who rely on these platforms, no consistent evidence that they know less about the disease. And the third key finding really that I wanted to highlight is that, of course, news and information matters a lot, but they're not the only things that matter. It's also clear that social and political factors matter in terms of how much people know about the crisis. So take, for example, as a social factor, in almost every country, people with lower levels of formal education know significantly less about the coronavirus. And in terms of politics, for example, we have sort of two quite important findings. One is that in 4 of the 6 countries, those people who identify themselves as being on the political right know less about the disease. We have no country in which people on the left know less about the disease. And also, I think, interestingly, the quite large minority of people, in most cases between 15 and 20%, who say that they don't know when we ask them whether they are on the left, in the center, or on the right politically, also know much less about the disease than the rest of the population. So these are the 3 key findings that I just wanted to go through quickly before we open up for questions and discussion. And I said I'm happy to go into a broader range of issues, but these were the ones I wanted to highlight for those of you who've joined this webinar today. So first, news media. As said, in almost every country, news is the most widely used source of information about coronavirus. And while it's clear that if you look further down the graph, that there are quite a large number of people who say that they rely on other sources of information, like the national government or national health organizations, or for that matter, scientists, doctors, and health experts, I think we can safely assume that when people say they rely on these other sources, often it is via the news that they get information by watching, say, for example, a government press conference or a science advisor speaking on a news channel or a similar platform. Of course, there are people who go directly to government websites or follow government social channels or see government advertising or get letters and the like. But I would say we can sort of safely assume that quite a lot of that reach is also driven by news organizations themselves, even if news media are not always credited with being the channels for such information from government, from experts, and from health authorities. The second thing I wanted to highlight about news media and their role and how people get information around the coronavirus is that while it's clear that we have a sort of quite a long-standing and broad-based crisis of confidence in many countries, where many people don't trust the news particularly highly, in this crisis there seems to be some signs that might be evolving, at least in some countries. So when we ask people, and I'm just showing the US and Germany as 2 examples of this, to rate how trustworthy they found the different sources of information that they could be relying on for news and information about coronavirus, it's clear there's sort of uncontroversial expertise from scientists. It's very highly trusted in every country by almost everybody. It's also clear that health organizations, whether at the national level like the NHS in the UK or at the international level like the World Health Organization, are highly trusted and also quite broadly trusted. I think where it gets more interesting and perhaps a bit sort of surprising given the discussions we've had for some years now about the crisis of trust in news is that in most countries, news organizations are more trusted and more broadly trusted than the government is. We can see this both in the United States, where 52% say that they find news organizations relatively trustworthy, whereas just 45% say the same about the government. And also in Germany too, again, you can see sort of news organizations and government are about tied, but But given the sort of the long concern about low trust in news, I think this is quite an interesting and perhaps in some ways surprising finding. It's worth mentioning here that in all the 6 countries that we cover in this survey, a majority say that they find the news a relatively trustworthy source of information about coronavirus. And that background for that is that last year, when we did our annual digital news report in these 6 countries and a number of other markets, less than half of the population say that they find most news trustworthy most of the time. So in that sense, I think there is some sign that there is a larger part of the population who are finding that on balance news is relatively trustworthy and more trustworthy often than the government, or for that matter, individual politicians, whom you can see in this case score very lowly in terms of trust. Just 27% in the United States say that they find individual politicians trustworthy. And similarly in Germany, just 39%. In both of those countries, significantly fewer than say that they trust ordinary people that they know trust politicians. The third thing I wanted to say about the role of news media in how people navigate information around the coronavirus crisis is the evidence that we have found that those who rely on news know significantly more about the disease than those who don't. Bear with me just for a minute as I explain this sort of slightly sort of cryptic chart that you see on the screen now. Basically, what we've tried to do is to go beyond just looking at, okay, here are all these people who use news media and this is how much they know. And basically, we're trying to use ordinary least square regression to essentially control for other variables. So for example, if old people know more about the coronavirus, is that because they are old, or is it because they are using the news more, as is the case in many countries? So using a regression model, we can control for these different variables, and we can see which relations are statistically significant and associated with either higher or lower levels of knowledge. And we measured knowledge by asking people 5 factual questions about the coronavirus, where in each case they could answer true or false or don't know, and where in each case we feel confident that there is an authoritative answer that is correct. So in that sense, we could score people from 0 to 5 in terms of how many of these questions that they gave a correct answer to. And the 5 questions are 4 that we've taken from the World Health Organization Mythbuster site, and 1 additional one that is a bit more political in nature. The 5 questions are thus, whether it is true that the coronavirus is less likely to be transmitted in hot weather, whether eating garlic can help prevent contacting the disease, whether older people are more susceptible to the disease than others, whether antibiotics are effective in treating the coronavirus, and finally, whether the coronavirus was made in a lab. So these are the 5 questions that we asked, and this gives us a way of scoring people in terms of how much they know about the disease. So what do we find when we look specifically at sources of information, controlling for other factors like age, gender, level of education, political persuasion, as well as reliance on different platforms like search engines, social messaging applications, and video sites? Well, we find here that in 4 countries, people who say that they rely on news organizations for information about the disease know significantly more about coronavirus than those who don't. The clearest effect is in the United States, where those who rely on news organizations on average score about a half a point better on the 0 to 5 scale in terms of how much they know. And if you sort of eyeball the chart here, you can see that there are very few other sources that are significantly related with more knowledge about the coronavirus. There are some, like relying on National Health Organization, in particular, and relying on scientists and experts, but these are not consistent to the same extent as the relationship with news organizations. And here I think it's particularly, important to notice that it's only in 2 countries, namely the UK and Germany, that those who say they rely on the government for information know more about the disease than those who don't. So this is, I think, a strong indication of how important independent professional news media can be in making sure that the whole population is more informed about the disease, a role that government can play a key role in, but can't lift on its own, it seems. The second area I wanted to briefly run through some key findings on is the area of the role of platforms, digital platforms of various sorts. Of course, I think everyone understands that there are lots of different digital platforms out there in the world. There are search engines, there are social media, there are messaging applications, there are video sharing sites, and that each of these platforms have different affordances, different operating principles, different business models and the like. So they aren't sort of a single thing we can talk about. But it's worth, I think, just trying to map the relative reliance on some of these digital platforms as a mean of accessing information around the coronavirus, which of course can be many different sources of information that in turn is made available via these platforms. So first, just in terms of the breadth of use, in the table on one side of the screen here, you can see some of the more popular and long-established search, social, and video sharing platforms. These are just some of the top ones from each of the 6 countries. So in most countries, between a third and half of our respondents say that they rely on Google search as a way of accessing information about the disease. A lot of people say they rely on Facebook. Quite a lot of people rely on YouTube and Twitter, and Instagram, much less popular, though I should add that it's very widely used amongst younger people in many countries as a source of information about coronavirus. The graph on the other side, you can see specifically around private groups on on Facebook's main social platform, and private groups on the messaging application WhatsApp, also owned by Facebook, where we've asked people whether they've been discussing the coronavirus in different kinds of groups on Facebook and on WhatsApp. And in every country, we see that quite a significant number of people say that they've been discussing this disease in different kinds of groups. Though I think it's important to note here that in every country, it's a much, much larger number of people who say they've been discussing the disease with people that they know, either their family, the dark blue bars, or in the orange bar, people who are friends and colleagues. And it's quite a low number in most cases who say that they've been discussing the disease with people that they don't know, using private groups, either on Facebook or on WhatsApp. And I think what this shows is that because the coronavirus crisis is so prevalent and so top of mind for lots of people, then groups that they are already in for other purposes, to stay in touch with friends, to stay in touch with family, to stay in touch with colleagues, are being sort of repurposed, at least in part, to discuss the disease in ways that really sort of build on pre-existing habits and communities, rather than being about a large number of people sort of seeking out large groups of anonymous strangers to discuss the disease, though of course some do that as well. The second thing I wanted to highlight about the way in which platforms play a role in the coronavirus crisis and how people seek information around it is the issue of trust. So this is a sort of similar type of chart, what I showed about different sources. In this case, it's about different platforms. What you see in the sort of blue side of the chart is the percentage of people in the US and Germany and in Spain who say that they who say that the news and information they find about coronavirus on that particular type of platform is relatively trustworthy. And what you see on the other side is the percentage of people who say that they find it sort of untrustworthy, essentially. So essentially the pattern here is this. Overall, the figures for trust are much lower for platforms than they are for news organizations. Just sort of averaging this up across the 6 countries we look at, what we might think of as sort of the trust gap between news organizations and different kinds of platforms is 35 percentage points between news organizations and messaging applications. It's 33 percentage points between news organizations and social media platforms. It's 30% between news organizations and video sites. And finally, it's 14 percentage points between news organizations and search engines. So much lower trust in all the platforms, but particularly much lower trust in video, social, and messaging applications as sources or platforms for information around the disease. The second thing, of course, is that conversely, much higher numbers of people say that they find these platforms untrustworthy as sources of information, or the news and information they come across there. Now, in some ways, it might seem somewhat puzzling in the sense that why would people rely on these platforms for news and information if they don't find the information particularly trustworthy? I think what it just illustrates is something we've known for a long time. If we look, for example, at the prevalence of populist sort of tabloid newspapers in many countries, is that people are perfectly capable of using media or media platforms without necessarily trusting them. And often, as a result, approach the information and content that they find there with sort of generalized skepticism, if you will. They use it, but they're not naively trusting of it. They're quite skeptical and are quite cautious in how much they might rely on this, whereas there's higher trust, as I showed before, in information from, for example, scientists and health authorities, but also news organizations. And I think this sort of skepticism towards the information that clearly in some cases is misinformation that people come across on social media and other major platforms is shown when we look at the relationship between relying on different platforms and then how much people know about the disease. This is using the same questions around knowledge that I talked about before. And again, we control for other factors, social and political factors like education, political persuasion, but also what sources of information people rely on. And what we find here, I'm just keeping in news organizations, government and politicians, just so you can see the difference, is that whereas with news organizations, as said, in 4 out of 6 countries, there is a significant positive association between relying on news organizations and knowing more about the coronavirus on the 5 questions that we ask people. When we look at the platforms, the picture is very different. Take search engines first. In 4 out of 6 countries, there is no association, no statistically significant association. And in 2 countries, in Germany and Argentina, there is a small positive association between relying on search and knowing a bit more about the disease. Social media, which is a center focus for a lot of concern about misinformation, but where companies like Facebook and others have also made ad credits available for health authorities and introduced information centers and the like about the disease. There, we find no relation either way. We find no evidence that people who rely on social media know more about the disease, but no evidence that they know less about the disease either. Video sites, in 5 of 6 countries, there is no statistically significant relationship. In 1, in Spain, there is a slight negative one. And finally, with messaging applications, in 4 of the 6 countries, no relationship. And then in Germany and in the US in particular, there is a negative association between relying on this platform and knowing a bit less about the disease. So quite a mixed picture with platforms, very widely used, much less trusted news organizations, and in most cases, no consistent relationship between relying on platforms and how much people know about the disease. The final area I just wanted to highlight a few key findings from before we open this up for questions in comments and the like, is the area of sort of social and political factors, which I think it's clear that sources of information and platforms for information are a key part of how people navigate what the World Health Organization has called an infodemic around the disease, with a sort of an explosion, tsunami of both credible and not credible information, some of it outright false and misleading. But it's also, I think, really important to remember that there are lots of other things that matter as well than just the sources of news and information that people rely on. Let me give you a very clear example of that, which is the case of political polarization in societies. So this is data specifically from the United States, which is more politically polarized than any of the other countries that we look at when we break down how much people trust different sources of news in terms of whether they are politically on the left, politically in the center, or politically on the right. So what you see in this graph is a situation in which, irrespectively of whether people are on the left, in the center, or on the right politically, very large majorities of people say that they have high trust in scientists and doctors and in health experts, between 81 and 89%. So very high and very broad trust in uncontroversial expertise. But then things change very quickly. So if you look at the figure on the left, which is the people who identify as being politically on the left, there is very high trust in news organizations. 70% say that they trust news organizations. So much, much higher than the percentage, 43, who say that they trust people that they know as a source of information about the coronavirus. And then you come to the figure about the government, where just 30% of Americans who identify as being on the left say that they trust information from the national government about the coronavirus. Fewer people on the left in the United States trust the government than trust people that they know as a source of information about the coronavirus. Just think about what a challenge that is for public health communication if a large proportion of the public has no confidence in the government itself as a source of information. And of course, each of us will have our own views about whether that skepticism is merited, in particular when the government is most prominently represented by a president who has a long history of making quite colorful and varied and not always entirely accurate remarks about this and many other issues. And I think this can sort of influence our interpretation of the figure for the people in America who identify as being politically in the center. Again, very high trust in scientists and doctors and health experts. Higher trust in news organizations and in government and in people that they know. So 57% of people in the political center say they trust news organizations as a source of information about the coronavirus. And again, then in the political center, basically the national government is in a statistical dead heat with people that they know as a source of information about the disease. So this is not just people on the left in the United States who are skeptical of the national government, it's also people in the political center. And then when we turn finally to people on the right, this is the last part of the figure, again, and this I think will come as a surprise to some, very high levels of trust in scientists, doctors, and health experts. And then people on the right in the United States, many of whom will be sympathetic to President Trump and to the Republican Party, there's very high levels of trust in information from the government. 68% of Americans on the right say that they trust information from the government about coronavirus. The figure for people that they know is lower, 48%. And then finally comes the kicker. People on the right in the United States find news organizations a less trustworthy source of information about the coronavirus than people that they know, right? Than ordinary people that they know. So think about if the government, challenge for the government is how do you reach people on the left and in the center who are very skeptical of the national government. I think the challenge for news organizations is how do you reach the very large part of the American population who are politically on the right and have so little trust in news organizations as a source of information. They trust people they know more than they trust professional journalists. This is an extreme example. The United States is more polarized along political lines in terms of trust than any of the other countries that we look at, but it's not unique to the United States. There are political polarization in other countries too. Spain is one example. There, of course, effectively, it's the mirror reverse of the United States, because whereas in the United States you have a right-wing government in power and people on the left being very skeptical of it, in Spain you have a left-wing government in power and people on the right being extremely skeptical of the government. And then you have a very interesting case in Germany where the Grand Coalition government led by the conservative Angela Merkel is very highly trusted as a source of information by people both on the left and in the center politically in Germany, but very interestingly has very low trust from people in the political right in Germany. So you see right-wing Germans very distrusting towards a conservative-led federal government. The final issue I wanted to talk about before opening up is not just the political side, but the social side of this, which is essentially about education. So this is where I draw, again, this sort of slightly cryptic graph. And for those who are interested in the full regression model, I'd refer you to the report. But basically, these are the social and political factors that we have controlled for in the model. And what we find is that in almost every country, people with higher levels of education know a little bit more about the disease than others, controlling for the sources of information they rely on and the platforms of information that they rely on. So this is quite, I think, a consistent pattern. And just a reminder that long enduring patterns of social inequality will inform not just how exposed people are to the disease and their ability to shelter in place, but also how informed they will be about the disease and how they can respond to it. And I think there is a real challenge there, both for government and for media, to think about how can we make sure that also those who have not had many years of formal education can be properly informed about the disease so they can make the decisions that they feel are right for them and for their loved ones and help protect their communities. And I think it's worth noting here also that in almost every country that we look at, news organizations are also struggling to reach people with lower levels of formal education. The other side of this is the issue of people who are sort of not very interested in politics and people who are sometimes, I think, actively alienated from political life and from established political parties. So if you look at the bottom of the figure here, this is a real kicker. This is the association between people who answer "I don't know" when we ask them in the survey, whether they are on the left and the center or on the right politically. So a minority of between 15 and 20% in most countries. And then how well they do on the 5 knowledge questions. People who say don't know to that question, who don't have any political persuasion, not interested or completely alienated from established political parties, do much, much less well on the 5 knowledge questions that we ask. So again, I think what we find here is an example of, and not a sort of so much a question of information, but about people who are basically sort of politically alienated from both news and politics as it's practiced in the mainstream. So these were the things I wanted to just highlight from the report for your consideration. As said, the report is very rich and quite varied and wide-ranging. So I'm happy to take questions on any part of the presentation or the report or other parts of the research that we've done at the Institute on information and misinformation around coronavirus. But the top line, I think, is very clear. In most countries, most people rely on news organizations for information about coronavirus. Most people say they trust them, and those who do rely on news organizations know more about the disease than people who don't. In most countries, people use a lot of different digital platforms to access information around the coronavirus, but often they don't trust those platforms and the information they find there all that much. And we find no statistically significant consistent relationship between relying on these platforms and how much people know about the disease, neither positive nor negative. And finally, as said, it's not just information, sources of information, platforms of information that influence how much people know about the disease. It's also social factors and political factors, long-standing inequalities, and for example, levels of education shape how much people know, just as people's political persuasions, and in some cases their lack of political persuasion, influence how much they know about the disease and how they interpret what they hear about it. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and I look forward to the discussion with all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rasmus. Really enlightening. We have a few questions, and we're going to have more. I remind everyone that, well, if you want to ask any question, just use the chat function, leave it there, and I will raise that to Rasmus. So the first question is from Simon Franz from BBC Global News. And Simon basically wants to know more about those regressions that you were talking about. He's asking, did you explore whether educational level is a factor in people's trust in news? So that would be the first question. And the other one is, did you explore whether age or educational level is a factor? Well, actually, it's adding age to the question. It's basically a question about trust in news and if it's caused or correlated with age or educational level.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. We haven't run the regression models where we control for other factors for trust as a dependent variable. So I can't really speak to what it looks like if we control for other factors. But just looking at the top line and how this breaks down by different groups, in almost every country, people with lower levels of formal education are much less trusting of the news media. They're also less likely to say that they rely on news media as a source of information. We find in some countries, but not all, similar issues around age, that young people are both less likely to rely on news organizations and also less likely to say that they trust them, but this is less consistent. And in both cases, I should stress again that we haven't control for other factors. So these are just the sort of the crosstabs where we break things down by different groups.
Great. The second question is from Richard Allen, our visiting fellow. And Richard is asking about platforms. He says, we have seen new development in this crisis with most major platforms pushing out official information from authoritative sources prominently to users. Is there any evidence of the effect of this yet in the way that people who get news from platforms are responding?
I think the short answer is no, we can't use this method to disentangle the sources, because what we ask about here is the platform. Do you use social media or not? It's not whether people came across World Health Organization information or not on a particular platform or some other authoritative source. So I think at this stage, we don't know. I guess I would offer as a hypothesis that in a situation in which on many platforms, at least some of the information people come across is probably not necessarily reliable and in some cases even misleading or false, it's hard to imagine how it can have made things worse to promote and prominently feature authoritative, accurate and credible information. So in that sense, I think there might be sort of countervailing forces here. And in that sense, I think there are lots of reasons to at least expect that this has made some positive difference. What I would say is that I would be very interested to see how this develops over time, because what we find here, I think, is that leaving aside news organizations, the other sources of information that seem to be consistently related to people knowing more about the disease are uncontroversial expert sources. But of course, I think as we have seen in the week since we closed the survey on April 7th, expertise will not always be uncontroversial. And as in particular, President Trump is ramping up his direct attacks on the World Health Organization and really questioning both their expertise and also, I think, increasing the sort of political controversy around relying on the World Health Organization, I'd be very interested to see how this develops, how trust evolves as these organizations become subject to the kinds of political attacks that the news media and journalists have long been subject to. And also whether we will then see people rely less on them as information, at least those who agree with the politicians who attack them. And also, of course, it'll be harder and harder for platform companies to privilege information if the source of that information is explicitly cast as politically controversial by major elected officials. So I think it's going to be, at this particular moment, there's been a moment where uncontroversial expertise could be credibly privileged by platform companies. But as that expertise potentially becomes more controversial, at least in some countries where politicians are attacking it, I suspect it'll be harder and harder to privilege it to the same extent.
We get a variation of that question from Leonie Susanto. It's not about platforms, but about governments. She said, this question bothers me. Can we trust media which inform the numbers of coronavirus outbreak in our country with the main source when the main sources are from the government? And I think this is a very interesting concern. In many countries, you know, the government is not very trustworthy. So what should the media do in this respect, Rasmus?
I think that's a great question. Even in the countries that we cover here, which are in the global picture relatively privileged ones, both in terms of their sort of wealth and state capacity, and also without being sort of necessarily always sort of fairy tale model democracies, are all broadly sort of more or less democratic and quite democratic. Of course, the situation you describe is much more pronounced in many other countries where the government is authoritarian and has a long track record of lying and dissembling in terms of matters of public communication. I mean, I think it's really is a challenge that just highlights the importance of professional journalism and quality editing. You know, no journalism can be more accurate or precise or reliable than the source of information that the journalists have been able to contact. And every journalist and editor will think about how to strike the right balance between being as clear and concise as possible, while also recognizing any uncertainty or ambivalence that may exist about what isn't known or what is known only provisionally or with some caveats. And I think it's a real concern in countries where the government is not to be trusted. Clearly, news organizations are doing the public a disservice if they provide a platform for those governments to simply spout whatever nonsense they might feel like spouting, or just mindlessly propagating numbers that are not in fact credible. I would say that while there are some news channels who seem to see fit to simply broadcast live press conferences and the like that are just full of nonsense, I would say that lots of news organizations are really being much more professional and more mindful of their primary obligation to the public and the importance of trying to establish the veracity and credibility of information before it's broadcast and spread to the public. And I have to say, I see this also in countries outside the six we look at here that are far more difficult to operate in, where the government is authoritarian or has a long history of lying, that people are trying their honest best. Of course, it's extremely difficult. At the end of the day, it's hard for journalists on their own to establish these figures. But I would say, I think I see many people doing it in a very professional and quite inspiring way.
And there's a great example, right, in Nicaragua of journalists trying to get the data themselves instead of trusting government.
I mean, the Nicaraguan government reports very few cases of coronavirus. Many public health experts, I think, have doubts about whether those very low numbers are credible in light of the fact that there are many more cases in neighboring countries. And it seems extremely improbable that the Ortega regime is right when they claim there is no community transmission in Nicaragua. To try to address that issue, a group of volunteers have created what they call the Citizen Observatory of coronavirus in Nicaragua, where they try to use combination of encrypted messaging applications, various sort of cloud-based survey tools and the like to collect information from sources, verify it, evaluate it, and then communicate using social media to both journalists and the wider public what a possible alternative number might be. But of course, it's extremely hard and very difficult and not always particularly welcome from the point of view of a government that doesn't particularly like being challenged by people who believe in various forms of what we might crudely put called freedom.
Great. We have a question from Jory Fleming asking, what are the key differences in these statistics about trust, platforms, news sources compared to other surveys that we have taken before coronavirus?
I mean, I want to stress here, I think these are not always directly comparable, so we should be cautious with extrapolating too much from them. And I also want to stress again, I think we should expect this crisis to evolve over time, in particular because politics in many countries are going to be very central to how different sources are trusted. And if this becomes a even more politicized and partisan issue than it has already been, I think the trust figures will start to look very different over time as people tend to take cues from politicians that they have confidence in or trust. That said, at this moment, I would say that the trust figures here suggest that in a moment of crisis, many people who might in ordinary times be skeptical of the media or at least indifferent towards the media are being reminded that having professional journalists whose work in turn is edited by professional editors is quite a useful thing if you actually want to know what's going on in the world beyond personal experience. And when your government is perhaps not always being entirely forthcoming or fully sort of transparent about what's actually going on. So I think in that sense, a lot of the sort of what we might think of sort of the soft middle or the unpersuaded middle, I think in this moment, at least in some countries, have regained some trust in journalism, and also I think some see some value in it that they may not have seen in more ordinary times.
Hopefully that sticks. We have a question from Line Nielsen, and she's kind of angling for scoop, Rasmus. She's asking if we plan to include more countries down the road in this kind of survey, and if so, which ones are we planning?
I mean, in principle, I'd love to do this kind of research in many more parts of the world. You know, we don't have a sort of an endowment to fund this kind of work, so I have to secure funding to be able to do it. I'm very glad that we had the support of the Oxford Martin School to do this initial report in 6 countries. I am in conversation with a couple of different funders, and in light of the Reuters Institute's mission of exploring the future of journalism worldwide, my first priority would be to try to do this kind of research in more countries in the global south, where I think we shouldn't expect others to be able to do this kind of research necessarily. And I think it's really, really important that we try to service journalists and citizens and NGOs and for that matter, governments and technology companies around the world so they can understand how this crisis plays out, not just in the wealthy countries in the West, but also in less privileged parts of the world. So that's something I would very much hope to do, but I have to figure out the funding side of this first. We're also trying to support the World Health Organization in developing a protocol for UN member states to field their own surveys, modeled off the work that we have done. So even if we aren't able to secure the funding to do this independently, perhaps we can still be of some assistance to different actors who are trying to respond to this crisis.
Amy Holiday asks about the kind of research that we do and asks if we have any data, our data or other people's data, on the general mood and attitudes towards the disease, and whether this depends on different factors.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I know that the Pew Research Center in the United States have fielded some surveys that ask people questions about how they perceive the disease as a threat to not just their personal health, but also the health of their community, not just to their personal finances, but also to the finances of their of the national economy and to the life of their communities. We are about to launch a set of surveys in the UK specifically, where we will try to track this over time. And as part of that study, we will also be asking people questions, not just about their knowledge and behavior, but also, as you suggest, about how they feel about the situation and how they feel it impacts different aspects of their life. So I hope to be back with more data, at least initially about the UK, but perhaps others are doing interesting work in this space as well.
Great. We have a question from Kate Barlett, our journalist fellow. She's asking, any different findings between countries with high death toll and not so much? And as an example, she adds Spain, UK, US, Germany, and the rest. I mean, there are countries with very different death tolls in our report, right, Rasmus?
I think that's a great question, Kate. We haven't found so far any particularly consistent patterns in that. As you rightly say, the casualties per million are very different in these countries during the time that we fielded the survey. So we don't really see any consistent pattern in that. I think my personal view is that this is just an interpretation. It's not something we have rigorously analyzed. Is that this is a powerful reminder of how central both news media but also digital technologies are for people's understanding of the world beyond personal experience. In many parts of these countries, very few, if any, respondents have anyone in their own private life who has fallen ill, let alone died from the disease. And almost everything that they will know and think and feel about the disease are based on things that they've experienced vicariously through news coverage and through digital technologies and the like. So in that sense, I think it's a really powerful reminder just how much media can be sort of extensions of ourselves, if you will, and help us understand the world beyond personal experience, but also perhaps sometimes in ways that are not sort of fully reflective of the situation on the ground, but more about how we respond to the information that journalists and others provide us with.
A question from Julian Wilkins. He's asking, did you inquire into factors that would increase trust in news organizations, or do you have plans to undertake such kind of research?
Thanks, Julian. We are going to start a project in that space in the near future that will both try to understand better what are the drivers of trust, so not just whether people trust the media, but also why, what are the factors that influence that, and also try to start working with different partners to test different types of responses, what can be done to influence trust. And I think it's important to stress here that I think everyone would like to be trusted. I would like to be trusted. I'm sure journalists and news organizations would like to be trusted. But I think we should also expect, as we pursue this line of research, that the findings may not always make for easy choices. So I would offer right now, as a hypothesis, that news organizations in the United States would be far more trusted by people on the political right if they were more deferential to President Trump and less aggressively scrutinizing the performance and expressions of his administration. That might lead to more trust. Would that be the right thing to do? That's a professional choice. I think there are many different values here, and trust is only one of them.
We have this great question from Franz Kruger from Wits University in Johannesburg. He's asking, do you have any sense of whether the way news organizations handle misinformation, for example, aggressive debunking versus false statements by prominent figures, has any impact on trust levels? So basically how to handle this kind of misinformation or false claims.
So this is not something that we can really get at in this kind of research, where I think we don't really have the sort of level of granularity where we can get at this at the level of individual news organizations, different strategies, or what people have come across. There are a lot of different people in the world who do fantastic research on fact checking and how it matters in different ways. I think one way to think about the top line is that the impact of fact checking is often less about the way in which individual citizens come across fact checks of stories, and more often about the indirect impact of fact checking in two ways. One, that for the very considerable part of misinformation, it really is a problem about powerful people who lie. In at least in some cases, in some countries, it turns out that being called out as being a liar has a modest disciplining effect on some politicians. So in that sense, I think there is an indirect effect that is more about being held to account for the sources of some information that is about necessarily matching sort of fact checks against individual citizens. The other area of indirect effect is that, of course, more and more fact checkers are collaborating with different platform companies like Facebook, like Google, and others. And as these very, very large and very powerful platform companies use their fact checks to make decisions about what content to promote, what content to demote, and in some cases, what content to remove entirely from their services and products, there too, I think fact checking can make a very significant difference. But again, it's not necessarily about the direct matching of sort of misleading claim, fact check, and then a person who has seen both the misleading claim and then later the fact check.
Teresa Becasis from Portugal asks, she wants to know about the relation of the education level with the knowledge about the virus. She said, this correlation seems very low, sorry. Mm-hmm. Higher education people know slightly more. Mm-hmm. Is that something that we are surprised about?
It's interesting. I sort of share what I take to be an element of surprise. I guess had I been asked before we ran the models, I would probably have guessed that there would be a stronger relationship in this. I think in some ways it's a reminder, which is, I suppose, is particularly pertinent for someone like myself who's burdened with more degrees than any sane person would ever want to acquire. That while education matters, lots of other things matter at least as much and sometimes more. So people can be very well educated, but if they're not following the news, they're not going to know as much about the disease. Or people can be very educated, but if they are politically disengaged or happen to be devoted to politicians who are demonstrably lying or misleading about the disease, then their education is not going to necessarily ensure that they are particularly informed, however informed they may feel with all their fancy degrees.
Maria Jarnadottir is asking about platforms that are not so mainstream. We in the report we find things about Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, others. She's asking about platforms like Reddit or Telegram. Do we have any data about how trust in information is impacting people who are using those platforms?
We do have a little bit of data that is much more granular in terms of different use of different platforms, and where we give people quite an extensive list of different platforms, including many of the ones that you named. In most cases, in most of the countries, we have so few respondents who use a lot of those platforms or say that they use them that it doesn't really make much sense to try to model it. So we have used instead the joint categories of search, social, video, and messaging, which I realize, of course, in some ways reduce the granularity, but I think it gives us at least an overall picture of what some of the major platforms, what the relationship is between using them and the knowledge outcomes. But I would be very interested to know more about some of these less widely used but still important platforms. I just think it requires larger data sets that we've been able to collect in such a relatively short period of time.
Alison Preston has a question about the questioning. She wants to know how we ask the trust questions. Did we ask trust questions to all respondents or just to those using that kind of source?
Thanks, that's a great point. Alison, like me, is a methods aficionado. We asked the trust questions of all respondents. Both the sources and platforms that I gave figures on in the presentation and are in the report, we asked those trust questions of all respondents. And the reasoning was essentially that these are sources and platforms that are widely enough known, even if not widely enough used, that everyone can form an opinion about them, should they choose to. Whether those opinions, in fact, are sort of accurate is a separate matter entirely. But I think it's reasonable in this case to ask people a question like this. And of course, there is always a don't know option.
A question from Kate Joins Burgess from the Nuffield Department of Population Health and the Oxford Internet Institute, so another Oxonian. The question, do we have any sense of how changes to the ways platforms are handling misinformation around COVID compared to pre-COVID misinformation is in turn changing trust levels? For example, Facebook creating verified COVID into hubs, YouTube stopping monetizations of COVID content, etc. I think a very similar question to Richard's question. Yeah.
I mean, I think at this stage, it's too soon to tell. We have one data snapshot. I know there are other people in other countries doing research, but I would be reluctant to make too much of a single sort of cross-sectional survey in terms of understanding change over time. We should be in a position to know more about that specifically in the UK, in part because Alison and her colleagues in Ofcom are doing research in this area, but also because, as I said, we will do more research over time here. So I think over time we'll have a better sense of it. As I suggested before in my response to Richard, I think politics is going to be quite critical to this, and frankly, probably more important than any particular action or initiative taken by any one company. If you imagine a situation in which a platform company that's used by almost everybody almost every day is actively promoting a source of information that a precedent that almost half of the people who bothered to vote in the last election, not quite half, but almost half of them voted for, and that many of them respect and have affection for, considers to be an untrustworthy and politicized source of information and perhaps a front organization for a hostile power. I mean, that's going to have a very significant effect on people's trust in the company in question. It'll be read through a political lens. So I think a lot hinges on how the politics evolve. And there, I suspect we will see quite predictable differences. There are some countries where this will be an extremely polarized and partisan issue. And there are other countries where I would expect a broader sort of political consensus to reign. Also in terms of showing a greater degree of deference and respect from the information coming from the World Health Authority than perhaps is shown by some people living in some White Houses.
We also have this question from Paola Tama from Politico, and she asked, did you gather insights on demographic factors like age or gender, and whether these have an impact on level of trust? Also, another question, did you have a sense of which messaging and social media platforms are more or less trusted? I think we have. Don't say that, right?
Yeah. So on age and gender, in terms of knowledge of how informed people are, we find no significant effects around age and gender. We control for both of those in the model. In terms of trust, again, and I will reiterate here that we haven't run the regression models for this. So this is just looking at the sort of crude breakdowns, and I should caveat that by saying there is no guarantee that those relations will hold up under closer scrutiny. But there are a number of countries in which younger people have less trust in news, and some countries in which they have more trust in search. Interestingly, in quite a lot of countries, younger people use messaging applications more, but also trust them less, which I think is quite interesting. So there, I think it's quite a complex picture, and I wouldn't make too much of it before we've had a chance to examine the data in greater detail. In terms of the trust in different messaging applications, the trust questions about platforms, we only ask at a relatively high level of generality. So that question is about search, about social, about video, and about messaging. And it's essentially just a question of survey practicality, if you will. We couldn't realistically do a survey where we asked lots of sort of very detailed questions about every single platform people could conceivably be using.
And we have a final question, also from our journalist fellow, Kate Bartlett. I think this is definitely the killer question in many countries. Is there anything the news media can do to win over those on the right who still do not trust us? Or is this a lost cause?
Well, I mean, I think there are two responses to this. One is that, yes, there are things to do, but as I alluded to before, there may be a price to pay for that in some cases. And it's a hard choice that individual editors and the journalists that they work with will have to make. And I'll say it again. I mean, I have no doubt that there are more conservative Americans who would have more trust in the New York Times and the Washington Post if those newspapers were less aggressive in their coverage of President Trump. But I understand entirely why Dean Baquet and Marty Baron doesn't feel that that is a price worth paying for building trust, and would prefer to think about other ways in which to try to build trust. I think they're making a really difficult choice, but a choice that ultimately I personally think is the right choice to make in that situation. So I think the second part then is, are there ways in which news organizations can build trust that are less sort of heads on, if you will, and are less about the politics? And I guess my main suggestion there would be that other factors that we know from other research are likely to influence trust are things that are more about familiarity and a sense of respect, if you will. And familiarity, I think, is in part about how can you think about as a news organization of how you can serve a wider range of needs than simply sort of news and analysis and informational needs. Are there ways in which you can help people by being a guide to their life and helping them navigate this quite challenging and difficult situation where people have to sort of rearrange their lives, both personally and professionally and in other ways? So is there ways in which non-political forms of journalism, sometimes service journalism, can be used to demonstrate value, build familiarity, and then with that, build trust that can then be drawn on in the more controversial moments. And in terms of respect, and again, I will offer this as an example, I think there is a really challenging moment right now for a lot of editors in terms of how they deal with, for example, coverage of the role of religious communities and religious leaders in this area. Again, take the United States as an example. Many Americans who are politically on the right are also very religious. And as a news organization, if a majority of your newsroom are secular or atheists, and if a lot of your news coverage sometimes can come across as if it believes that religion is sort of a quaint superstition, even if it's intensely meaningful and really, really important for lots of people, then that's a serious problem for your trust if you come across to a large part of the population as if you were essentially being sort of condescending towards them and not respectful of things that matter to them. So I think in that area, the question of how does one show respect, not necessarily deference and not blind sort of acceptance of, but respect towards really, really profound differences in values and orientations, while still sticking to the idea that the cardinal principle of journalism is to seek truth and report it. I think that's the challenge. And I know that the easy part is saying that's the challenge. And the really difficult part is that you and other journalists and the editors you work with, I have to make those choices every day. So good luck.
That's a great note to finish. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rasmus. Three things, quick things to finish. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for your hard work and to keeping us informed during this difficult time. Second, if you signed up for this, and you did because you are here, you're gonna receive an email with the presentation, the video of the presentation, and the slides, and also, you know, links to the report that Rasmus discussed and other things. And finally, please follow the advice of your government and, you know, wash your hands and stay home if you have to stay at home, and try to stay sane in this kind of nightmare. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We will be back next Thursday. We appreciate your questions, and, well, we'll see each other very soon. Thanks, everyone.